we can build some complexity, right? Because it's not as simple as one cross section. Because what if in Game of Thrones you chop me here at my waist versus here, right? You'd still be chopping that spinal cord apart, and you'd be able to look and see they look a little bit different because they're structurally organized just a little bit different, right? So I'm not a robot, right? I'm not a tree where it's just a tree trunk with a spine that just goes up. All of us are not like that, right? I just say me because I'm here that you can look at, but we're all kind of the same. Our spine kind of does this nice little curve, right? You get that little element, and so it's not. Well, it's going to look different at different slices, and that's what this is showing. So you can categorize different sections of the spinal cord. You have basically this top part, or the cervical part, and all the way down to the bottom, basically your tailbone. Okay? Coming up, you're going to have the sacral end, the lumbar end. Okay, so this is where you're going to have that little curve in the back of your back, right? Where you hate it when guys kind of move you along trying to get a drink in the bar. Push your lower back. No, right? Okay, that's going to be down here. Okay? Lumbar, sacral areas. You can see they're colored a little differently. Well, what can we see that differs? If we just look between this slice and this slice, we can start to see there's differences in sort of the shape of the relative gray matter to white matter. Those horns that we introduced, right? The dorsal and ventral horns, they're starting to change shape. Look up here. If we can move up a little bit more, I'm going to call it north for now, but we're going to see that we're going to have some other anatomical directions that come to us in a moment. Okay? So we're going to come a little bit more upwards from the spinal cord and look at this gray matter compared to this gray matter. Look at all this white matter compared to the relative little amount of white matter. Right? Because those bundles are getting thinner and thicker as we're moving into different areas up and down the spinal cord. Does that make sense? Okay. And of course we get up to the sort of cervical area, and we can see that it starts to get a little thicker there then too. Sound good? Any questions? Okay. Just some organizational pictures on what we have here, so you'll see some. So basically the point here is that through the course of this class and possibly others, you might see different sections of spinal cord on different slides or different pictures. And they might end up looking really different. And I always found that that was really confusing because I'm like, this doesn't look like the spinal cord slice I looked at yesterday or a slide ago. And then I realized, oh yeah, the spinal cord is different at different spots. That's why it looks really different. And you could have something that looks like this versus this. But it took me a long time to kind of actually integrate that idea because nobody actually explained it in that way. And I got confused why different slices looked really, really different. But that's why you might see different slices portrayed in that way as we move through the course. Okay? Now here's a more specific way of looking at this element in the central nervous system. Okay, so this is our spinal cord. Now here, again, we are coming from the bottom up to the top. Okay? So kind of like Drake. You're starting down here. Okay? You guys didn't know that? He started at the bottom.
Yeah.
That's what it says.
Yeah, now he's here. And so, that's all I got. So, as we're moving along, we can see that our spinal cord itself is, right, we called it, with no pun intended, the nerve center of the brain, right? We have the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. We kind of already know, I think, hopefully everybody in the class, that those are like the core important parts of the nervous system, right? Nobody wants to break those parts, right? And because of that, our nature comes in and does everything it can to protect it, with layers and layers of protection. Okay, so you're going to have some sort of thin layers. Okay, you can peel off different layers. So this is our spinal cord. It's encased in several layers, what we might call meninges. Okay, so this is our spinal cord. Right on top of it is a layer of meninges called pia mater. Then on top of that, it's basically a thin little skin-like membrane. On top of that is another skin-like membrane of the meninges called the arachnoid. On top of that, to get to that, you have to first peel off another one called dura mater. These are all three considered the meninges. Okay? They're membranes. You have to peel them off. Okay, and let's see here. In Latin, dura means tough. Okay, mater, I believe, means mother. It means tough mother. You can see where they're going. All right, very, yeah, very thick, tough protective outer casing, so that if in battle somebody first cracks the first line of defense, which is your bones, your vertebra that encase all this, and you're already screwed over because you just broke the vertebra, right? You're probably out laying on the ground hoping that a stretcher will come pull you off the field of battle, right? Or fell in the jungle getting chased by a tiger or whatnot, right? Nature wanted to make sure that just because this outer protective coating, bones, were broken, that we didn't automatically introduce way more worse stuff, like all the dirt from the battleground and other bacteria and viruses. So you have all these layers protecting it. And the same is true of the brain, so we'll take a closer look at that. So we have these different elements. This is another way of looking at what we talked about before. Okay, so here we've actually changed. I'm not looking this way anymore. This is me. I'm now looking this way. And we know that because when we look at these roots and the ganglia, we can see that now the dorsal column's back here, and these are the ventral ones, which tells us that I have to have rotated in order for this to be an accurate figure. So we'll see that, and this is why so obviously tests are very lecture-based. A lot of this stuff, you got to know this stuff, not just read the book. You really have to do both, because I'll add different pictures from different books into the slides if I think they tell a better story or help to clarify the story that the book is already telling. So again, you'll see this rotation now. So now we're looking at just the opposite way around. And again, remember we talked about that white matter rising up from sort of SoCal and NoCal Highway 5, or 99, I guess you take either one, right? And this is that white matter rising up. So you can see it kind of three-dimensionally, and that's why it comes in between these horns, these gray matter horns. Now, you get the sensory information coming in through the dorsal root ganglion, into the dorsal root. Synapse can come up vertically, like we talked about, or it can come and make a synapse through an interneuron or a direct connection on motor neurons, where their nuclei are here. As your potential quiz question asked us, it comes from the central nervous system, that motor neuron comes out. We'll move it on real leg. Does that make reasonable sense? So mostly just shows the same thing. We've got columns of axons that run vertically up the spinal cord. It can be a dorsal column or it can be a ventral column. We have horns that can be dorsal and ventral. We have roots that can be dorsal and ventral. And we have ganglia as well. Sound pretty good? So I'm trying to take a bunch of this information that's packed in here and unpack it in sort of a digestible, understandable way. So that's sort of our somatic. Let's talk about a little bit about our autonomic nervous systems. So remember we said sort of our on and off, sort of push and pull complementary systems. Okay, easy to think about as the fight or flight systems. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system is going to prepare the body for action in a fight or flight experience. Okay, now we talked about it going to a lot of these sort of organs. So you got the gut area, so your intestines, your pancreas, your gallbladder, your stomach, digestion, right? Reproduction, going to the bathroom, breathing, pumping blood in your heart, okay? So different elements of these systems, okay, can either slow the heartbeat or accelerate the heartbeat, okay? So your parasympathetic system is going to actually be driven in a lot of times with acetylcholine neurotransmitters, and it's going to be involved in sort of slowing down your heartbeat. Okay? Now, acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. It's a really long sort of words. cooling, and you'll see it abbreviated as basically just ACH. Makes it easy. Okay. Sympathetic nervous system, instead of slowing the heartbeat down, it's going to be involved in accelerating the heart. Okay? When you really got to get going, you get that, oh shit feeling, the tiger's chasing me. Gotta pump some blood. Get out of here. Activate. Right? You get that smile from that really cute person that you've always had a crush on. Right? The heart might start fluttering a little bit. Okay? Sympathetic nervous system is going to be driven by a chemical called norepinephrine. Okay? Okay, sort of a derivation of epinephrine, or what you might have in EpiPen. If any of you guys are EMTs or paramedics, or people have allergic reactions, or you need to reactivate that system using EpiPen. Right? You guys seen Pulp Fiction?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Remember the scene?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have to explain it.
Yeah.
Right? You need to activate that system. They were trying to, right? It was a little too slow on a heartbeat that she had in that scene in Pulp Fiction. I'm going to change this and turn it into that. So they used an epinephrine pen. Okay? Okay, so we can go through point by point by point, but know that basic element. Some of the transmitters involved in it, know that they will be involved in the relative activation or inhibition of these systems. And they're going to have those differential effects based on the neurotransmitters. And take a look at the way that this is structurally organized, by the way. Okay? This is a lot of stuff to unpack in this figure. But, okay, we have our parasympathetic nervous system, okay, coming out through some of these cranial nerves, and they're driving, right, the sort of relaxation, okay? So, at least slowing the heartbeat, right? Constricting our airways. It's activating our salivation, constricting our pupils, okay? Digestion, releases bile, dilates blood, contracts the bladder, okay? But none of that is being sent structurally through these middle parts of the spinal cord. So basically, these top parts by our cranial nerves, and some of the sacral ones as well, for digestion and reproduction. Now, on the other hand, we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, okay? Not really relying on our cranial nerves so much here, but all of our middle spinal nerves, okay? So you have a structural organization of these systems as well, in terms of the activations, respectively, of them, okay? And not a lot down here in the sacral segments, as you do there. Okay? Help to kind of clarify a little bit. So they're just two systems, and that's kind of the extent that we'll work with them. Let's see here. So that sympathetic nervous system is more that fight or flight, right? Emotional stress, physical emergencies, and we're going to slow the activity of the organs, increasing digestion by virtue of the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, now let's see. Let's see if this picks up here. We'll do see if this works. Some education.
Come power, baby. Oh, now, baby. Spring quarter, baby. Work harder, baby.
It's actually from a biology class at Stanford.
Parasympathetic nervous acting to it.
ACH.
Sympathetic, put no heavier to it.
Parasympathetic nervous acting to it.
The lyrics down here is actually very good.
Nervous acting to it.
Put no heavier to it. Love the blood, and he's speeding up your heartbeat. Pump a cardiac muscle, get it started. EKG is charted. What? You arrest. Ventricles contracted, then they curve through your chest. Your heart is pumping till the day you die. It just pumps a little quicker when I come by. And when I yank say FB or Brit say adrenaline, the same chemical to make your heartbeat begin again. So that I mention the effects of the EpiPen. Same stimulus, sympathetic, sending in blood vessels coming straight. Bronchioles dilated. Increase water retention, don't get hydrated. Repping up and get your pressure up. Send the dial spinning on that blood pressure cup and improve your sight. People's wild tonight. Getting sweaty, getting ready for that fight or flight.
Feeling even more stressed.
I am
Activated adrenal cortex.
cortisol into your fluid.
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 Fluid. Fluid.
Parasympathetic, put some act into it.
Sympathetic, but no refuge to it.
Parasympathetic, put some act into it.
Sympathetic, but no refuge to it.
Put some act into it.
But no refuge to it.
Hey, yo, nobody, let me ask you a question.
Go ahead, then.
If you wanna be digesting or resting, what's the body gonna make? A neurotrans that is banned called ACH. Sympathetic system's got you ill at ease. Here's a little glimpse of parasympathetic abilities. A fetal call make your heart rate chill as beat. Not to mention activating your motility. Like paracelsus or hostration. Cause digesting your food is all about patience. Not to say that relations are antagonistic.
So good in the autonomic nervous system.
Gut enzymes secreting.
They do.
Digest the food you eating.
Put amylase into your fluid.
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 Fluid. Parasympathetic, put some act into it.
Sympathetic, but no refuge to it.
A parasympathetic, put some act into it.
Sympathetic, but no refuge to it.
I'll put some act into it.
Put no refuge to it.
Does that help? What's that? Good. Good. That means it helps you remember. That's why we did it. So, yes, I thought they did actually a pretty good job.
Yeah.
You know? And so I sometimes I would, I used to teach from a book where they didn't devote any attention to the neurotransmitters involved in supporting these two systems. But yet I would test them on which neurotransmitters support each of these respective systems, and they mostly got the questions correct. Because the song being impossible to forget. Right?
Yes.
Right? As long as you remember, you know, parasympathetic, put some act into it, then you know that the other one is norepinephrine. That's norepinephrine. So that's how we start introducing those over here, because hopefully that will help you remember during the test. Right? So if any of you guys actually took the time to follow the recommendations that I made the first day, which is to check out the syllabus supplement, which is something we went to a lot of work to create for you guys in terms of some strategies for what we know scientifically leads to successful learning and remembering of material, which is what we're all trying to do in our classes. One of the core ways to do that is to contextualize what we're learning in memory and not have it just be rote regurgitation, but to do lots of cross-modality integrations. So if you want to not forget stuff, make it a complex, rich, woven tapestry, right? Tie together a bunch of elements, like a rhyme, like a beat, some music, a story, right? Why do you think we tell kids stories, right? Fables and other things like that. We need them to remember certain principles or lessons that are usually embedded in those, right? As opposed to you just tell kids to remember, you know, an algebra equation or something like that. They're typically not. Well, when we really need them to remember stuff, we put it into a song like A, B, C, D, F, G, right? Right? If you just tell kids, hey, here's 26 symbols.
Learn.
Know this shit. There's gonna be a test. Right? like your 4-year-old's gonna look at you like you're nuts. They're gonna be like, you want me to do what? But there's a lot of them. How do I do this? Well, how you do it is you add a rhythm to it. You add some other type of woven integration, multisensory stuff. So use that not just to remember some of these systems, but some of that example or video, but create those similar types of strategies for other things you need to remember. I actually used to have a project in class where students would create their own rap videos, see if they could outdo Science with Tom. Some of them did. They did it really, really good. I mean, I have to admit that in Bernardino we can make better videos than I can for those dorks up at Stanford. But so we'll see. See if you guys accept that challenge. Anyways, so that's kind of our overview of our basic nervous systems. Let's get into some more of these details, okay? Let's get into some of the features, okay? So we talked about the central nervous system. Now we're going to really dive into that a lot, okay? There's a couple of core elements, okay? So we've already talked about the spinal cord elements, okay? As we move up from the spinal cord, okay, we start entering into the brain, okay? Okay, we're going to go through an area that we'll see there's a medullum, a cerebellum, there's a little bulb here that we call pons, okay? And this is kind of the hindbrain back here. Okay, the forebrain is up here. You've got this, basically the cerebral cortex and this sort of diencephalon or the thalamus, all right? And then in between the forebrain and this hindbrain is what's here shown in purple, this little tiny segment that we call the midbrain. I'll give you guys a guess why they call that. Right? It's between the mid and the fore and the hindbrain, so they ran out of options, and it's the mid, right? So pretty easy to remember in that regard, okay? So the medulla is basically there with your brain stem connecting to the actual spinal cord. As we move up a little bit, sort of the top, more posterior or anterior part of the brain stem, you're going to get that pons, just this green sort of bulb. Okay, so here we're looking at a sideways view. We're looking at it this way, looking forward like I am. You'll see that little bulb there of the pons. Okay, you got your medulla here shown in sort of pink. Cerebellum here is that sort of big thing here. And you can see that they're in green, and then of course the forebrain shown in blue. Okay, the diencephalon, as I mentioned, is the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and that cerebrum, as opposed to the cerebellum. Okay, cerebellum is the bottom part, cerebrum is our cortex, kind of the bigger part. We also have some stuff in the middle of these different areas, and they form their own sort of labyrinth and series of connections. We call them ventricles. Okay, it's what ends up making cerebral spinal fluid, which is something that helps kind of the brain floats in. And that's a big overview. We're going to dive into those different elements in more detail as we move along here, okay? So again, we talked about that cerebral cortex and the fact that there's two different layers. When we look into that cerebral cortex in a little bit more depth, or specificity, I should say, we will see that we can categorize it based, again, really gross morphology. I don't mean disgusting, I just mean broad in general. Morphology means shape and sort of areas. So we can categorize four big parts of it. So you've got the frontal lobe, okay? And all the way in the back, we have something called the occipital lobe. The temporal lobe is on the side. It wraps around the bottom. And then this sort of top part up here is called the parietal lobe. Okay, so you have four main lobes, and they're on each hemisphere. So you have two frontal cortices, two occipital lobes, two parietal lobes, and two temporal lobes. Okay, they're going to comprise that big cerebrum, or the forebrain, whatnot. And they're going to have lots of folds, okay? Those folds are basically called gyri. A single fold is called a gyrus, okay? Now, when you have a fold like this, right, there's also these valleys. The valleys are called sulci. A single valley is called the sulcus. And you can help to remember that by knowing that if you're down in the dumps and having a bad day, you're sulking. Right? You're down in a valley, right? Of your mood at that time. You're sulking. So sulk, sulci, or sulcus. And then you know that the other one, gyrus, means the top of the hill of the fold. Now, evolutionarily, and there's just how you spell gyri and sulci. This is the plural form, by the way. A gyrus is a singular form. A sulcus is a singular form. Now, evolutionarily, these represent a big sheet of brain cells and cortex, right? And as we evolved through the annals of historical time, we wanted to be more and more advanced, and we wanted to cram more and more brain tissue into our tiny little baby craniums. And the thing about craniums, if any of you guys have children, you know that craniums don't grow very fast, right? Our skulls are bone, right? You can't really get more. It's a finite amount of space. You can't cram more stuff in there, then it's not going to expand because Gall was wrong. And so you have as evolution came around, started folding this neural sheet of tissue so that it could grow more of its brain cells, but pack them in a lot more tighter. So it's like, if this was your cortical sheet, neural tissue at first, right? How do you get this to fit into a tiny little container? Well, you gotta fold it, right? If you fold it up, you can get it all sorts of ways, much smaller. And as it's folded, you can see that it has gyri on its own side. And that's why we have this at a generic level. So we'll see a lot more specificity of different areas, but that's the starting point, okay? And that's kind of obviously where they're located. As we look to a medial view, looking in the middle of the brain now, okay, we can see some other features. So this is right down the middle. If you cut me this way, and then open it up, and then turn me this way. So you're looking this way. In the middle is this big white thing called the corpus callosum. That's a big tract of axons that connect the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and they allow them to talk, essentially together. Here is the inside part of our frontal cortex, as is this, and we have the anterior, or this is the cingulate cortex. This is more broadly the cortical areas, okay? So the cingulate cortex can have an anterior part, a middle part, or a posterior part of the cingulate. This is the inside part of that parietal cortex. This is the inside part of that occipital cortex. Okay, this is the inside part of that temporal lobe. What we'll see is actually the medial temporal lobe. Right? Very near and dear to my heart, metaphorically, of course. That's where a lot of memory action happens. Here's that pons, okay? Medulla, as it comes down and connects to the spinal cord. Back here we have that cerebellum. It has lots of folds. There are more neurons here in the cerebellum than there are in all the rest of the brain combined. Cerebellum being Latin for little brain. Because it is a little brain. We also don't know very much about it relative to the rest of the brain. It's a very difficult area to study, and we don't know very much in comparison. So if you're looking to carve a niche for yourself and really explore some outer frontiers, that's an area you can zero in your homing beacons on. Okay. We have the diencephalon, our thalamus, and hypothalamus down here, as well as our pituitary gland. Controls a lot of hormonal regulation. And again, we talked about our midbrain in here. So that's going to be. Then we have the pons and medulla there. So lots of things. For those of you guys who are Descartes fans, here we have this pineal gland. Nice and medial, centrally located in the brain. Any questions on this basic element? Hypothalamus. Thalamus is kind of, or thalamus up here, it's kind of like the big relay station of sensory information. Any sensory information that comes in, vision, hearing, touch, taste, before it goes to different cortical areas, this is the relay station. It comes into the thalamus. It's kind of like a train station that switches the trains onto the right tracks. It's kind of like a layover or connection flight of an airport. The information comes in and it gets relayed to the right spot in the cortex to process our sensory information. Very important structure, that thalamus, for just about everything we need to do because of that critical relay it provides. Just ventral to that thalamus is our hypothalamus, okay? And the hypothalamus is going to be involved in a lot of hormonal regulations, and famously referred to, if you need to remember what it does the 4 F's. So fight or flight, right? If you're hungry, you got to feed. So fight, flight, feeding, and reproduction. Okay, we look at the brain from the bottom view. We already did this once for our cranial nerves. Now we're doing that again. We can see some of those cranial nerves here still. We have the olfactory bulbs. Here's that optic chiasm for our optic nerve coming in. Okay, we have these little sort of bulby structures called the mammillary bodies. Okay, our pituitary gland that we just talked about is right there, which is going to be that bottom stalk of the hypothalamus. The cerebellum again is going to be our little mini brain here. It's sort of like mini-me for Dr. Evo. Okay. And spinal cord is going to connect the medulla up to the pons. And here's that temporal lobe. Okay, the medial part of it is going to be more towards the middle. This is the lateral out to the side. So our medial temporal lobes are a lot of memory action happens. And of course, our frontal cortex here. The really bottom parts like this, we might see called the orbital frontal cortex. Okay. And so some key landmarks to be aware of. Okay. As we mentioned, we have some big fissures or sulci that we call fissures. So there's a really big vertical one that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. That's called the central sulcus. Okay? Now along the central sulcus, we have a big gyrus in the frontal cortex. We have another big gyrus in the parietal cortex. Okay? This is basically, well, because it's before our central sulcus, we call it the precentral gyrus. And because this is after our central sulcus, we call it the post-central gyrus. Pre meaning before, post meaning after, like a post-game show for a basketball game or a football game or something like that. Okay? We also can call these oftentimes by functional names. So this precentral gyrus is often called the motor cortex. We talked about that a little bit with Rich Hitzig's recordings from the dogs, as well as Sir Charles Sherrington's electrical recordings from the motor cortex of gorillas. Okay? Somatosensory cortex is going to be here, where our sense of feeling and touch is processed on our postcentral gyrus. We also talk about the difference between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, and that's going to be defined by this big long sulcus called the sylvian fissure. When we get in further and deep in the anatomy, we'll see that we can come in here and pull this apart a little bit and really take a close look at it. Okay? Let's see here. Of course, we got the olfactory bulbs. You can see kind of creeping in here into this sort of this orbital frontal cortex on the bottom here. That's the calcarine sulcus back there as well. And okay, so this kind of shows the same information. So I'll move through this to save time. I have all these pictures here, and I think you guys already have access to these slides. So a lot of this is just here to show you the same thing in different pictures. So that's why when I move through it quickly right now, that's all I'm doing. I'm saying, we've already talked about this. If you need another way to look for it, I post it here, and you can revisit it. But it's just another way of illustrating some things, because some people have it connect in different ways. So this is a way of looking at that corpus callosum. So we talked about that. Here's white matter tract connecting the left and the right hemispheres. And we take this coronal slice. This is our corpus callosum connecting the gray matter here with the gray matter here by virtue of the highways of the white matter tracts that connect it. Okay? And when you look down on top of the brain, from the top down this way, take a scoop, go and scoop out, we can see that it radiates up these big, thick white matter connections by virtue of this corpus callosum here. And sometimes, for different clinical situations or epilepsy, when there's too much activity talking between the left and right hemispheres, they'll have doctors do basically a cut of the corpus callosum. And you result in what's called split brain patients, which are patients who basically have a split between the left and the right hemispheres of their brain, and they have some very unique deficits in vision and attention and language and other things that reveal some key insights into the hemispheric lateralization of the brain and how those hemispheres communicate. The pioneer who did that in large part was Michael Gazzaniga. He actually coined the term cognitive neuroscience. He invented the field, kind of. Actually went in a taxi cab in New York about 30 years ago. Very famous story. And he's very, very prominent in the field. He's now in a retirement position running a Center for Cognitive Neuroscience at UC Santa Barbara. And some really, really good books. Good textbooks, pop culture books. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, particularly split brain patients, that's the guy we would talk to a lot. Cut those like that. Okay. So let's talk about some of these directions that we've been referring to.